Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to another installment of the LSTM seminar series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Diederik van Halsma. I'm the Communications Director of LSTM, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you today Chris Lockyear, Secretary General of MSF. It's about a decade ago, when we were both working for MSF, that Chris left the organization to go to the US to take up a World Fellowship with Yale University. After that, he became Operational Director for Action Against Hunger, ACF, in New York. Returned to the UK for a Masters in Philosophy and Ethics before he took up his current post, Secretary General of MSF. Basically, the big spider in the web to keep the executive roadshow of the organization on track. Some of you have met him this morning. A particular welcome also to the LEAP students who are this week here at LSTM. This particular educational program for humanitarians is for those of you who don't know it, a partnership between LSTM, MSF, and the University of Manchester through its Humanitarian Conflict and Recovery Institute. So, a very opportune moment to hear more about the work of MSF and the work of Chris. So, I hand over to him.
Thank you. I'm not sure I've ever been described as a spider, the spider before, but much worse at times. So, thanks. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming today. It's amazing to have such a packed room starting on time. It's an achievement for me to be able to have a quiet audience ready to go on time. So thanks very much. As Diederik mentioned, I've been in my position for a year now, and that, I would say, has been 12 months of realizing how little I don't know about the organization that I work for, and I've spent about 12 months diving into trying to understand how we operate, what we do, how we work, how this whole thing holds together. And so I personally hope that doing this seminar is a little bit of a step outside of that internal box which I've been encompassed with for the last 12 months or so. So I'm really happy to be out of the spider's web and to be engaging a little bit more broadly for once. Before I jump into the content of the presentation, I wanted to just sort of set the tone a little bit. This isn't going to be a deeply academic presentation, which I hope is a relief for some of you. It will be relatively anecdotal and certainly uncritical in a rigorous academic sense, but probably a little bit critical in the opinionated sense. In terms of just before we kick off, in terms of a couple of caveats in terms of how this is presented and how you see it in front of you. It's framed as a little bit in terms of the changing world, but I think it's important to point out that I make no claims as to whether the world is changing faster, slower, differently to how it's ever changed before. In fact, that I would say that the normative reference for this conversation is that change is the usual, and it would be slightly strange if there wasn't change happening in the world. So, bizarrely, change is the constant in that sense. The other thing that I'm going to try and avoid, which is a little bit difficult when you're talking about challenges, is the sort of the never worse-isms, and the world has never been worse. There's never been more refugees. There's never been more wars. There's never been more people on the move. That said, there will be a bit of a dive into some of the challenges that we have, and but I think the important thing when we're looking at these challenges, these trends that we face, that it's okay to be unsure about the legitimacy of what we're saying when we're talking about these trends that we see, these challenges that we face. For me, the key thing, a key element of humanitarianism itself is about seeing through these trends, about seeing through these aggregated data. It's about seeing through global narratives to try and see the person and the people who are behind that. So we can look at big data, we can look at big statistics, we can look at who's performed well in the Millennium Development Goals. Ethiopia did extremely well when it comes to health indicators and to education indicators. That doesn't mean that there can't be a crisis of health in the Ogaden. It doesn't mean that because you're doing well on a development scale, it doesn't mean that that a humanitarian crisis can't happen within that same context. So for me, I think humanitarianism should be seen as something of a antidote to aggregated figures and to dogmatic narratives, and it should be an exercise in working through the simplified discussions that we see in the media and that we often discuss with each other. It's about being critical of our assumptions and avoiding this simplification. That said, I'll look a little bit at some of the key global developments that I think have a particular impact on the humanitarian context, and a little bit in terms of how they impact on our operations. I'm very aware with this audience that we've got huge different levels of experience in this field, and there's going to be a lot of people that have more direct experience than I have in a lot of the contexts that we mentioned. So I caveat that with an apology if I get the details wrong, and please at the end we'll make sure there's time for you to correct me. I'm going to try and not speak for too long and try and open it up for as many questions and answers as we can possibly achieve. So initially, to look at some of the big discussions that are ongoing at the moment, we hear a lot about challenges to the post-Second World War order, the normative frame that we've been used to over the majority of the last century, discussions around how useful is the UN, how good is the Security Council at coming to decisions, that states are becoming stronger, that it's harder for us to gain access to patients. Well, yes, but I think it's very important to be a little bit skeptical when we're discussing these things, because these global trends, these global statements, in my mind, manifest themselves very differently at a local level. And I think that the strategic challenge for us is not necessarily addressing these issues, but trying to identify how things like migration, multilateralism, criminalization, which I hope to talk a little bit more about in a minute, actually manifest locally. I mean, and it's the type and nature of these trends that we need to start breaking down a little bit, rather than just saying, well, the UN's crap and so therefore we should avoid it. We need to look at how these issues manifest at a local level. So although the trends may be global, regional or transnational, we're still in a situation where we have Westphalian model of statehood. We have sovereignty to deal with. We have monopolies of power and violence through which, when we are either sat here in the UK or in South Sudan or DRC, we're faced with a local manifestation of that. And I think one of the key challenges for us is to work out, okay, yeah, there is a global trend here, there is something going on at an international level, but how does it break down into a local, regional, or even a district level? And I think one of the key questions for us is how do we address these issues from a narrative point of view? On one hand, we want to be able to practically address, from a humanitarian or program perspective, the needs of people that we see, but we also want to challenge it from a global perspective. And I think when we do that, what we need to start doing is to breaking down these problems to a little bit more detail. Some of the manifestations that we see, I guess nothing particularly surprising here for most people, but we're seeing localized, again, bringing it back to national and regional policies. We're seeing regional policies which are impacting on people being able to move in different ways in different places. So it's important to avoid the dogmatic, there's more migrants before, we've got a migration problem. Yes, we've got several migration problems, all of which are different in different locations. When it comes to issues of criminalization of aid, which I want to talk about in a little bit more detail, it's a very easy thing to say. It's a lot harder thing to conceptualize and then also work out how to tackle from both a programmatic but also a political perspective. So we see political change, we see a change in our legal frameworks, but we also see change in the humanitarian sector in which MSF, along with many other organizations, is present within. And in this particular slide, I want to focus a little bit as an example on the third point there, which is the UN's new way of working, or the Nexus discussion. For those who are not familiar with it, it's about developing a continuum of programming and response, ranging from the most critical into a development phase, previously known as recovery phases. For me, this issue is particularly problematic, and it's problematic because of the inherent assumptions that there are behind it. Looking at it from a programmatic perspective, in terms of the needs of people as they progress over time, on one level makes a lot of sense. You have a more critical phase, a more urgent phase, an emergency phase, which then moves hopefully into something more stable. Then you can develop longer term strategies and hopefully develop a little bit of self-capacity building within people affected. On one level, that makes total sense, and I can sort of, to some extent, accept that notion in a context that's perhaps been affected by a natural disaster, in a context where there is some linear progression in the political umbrella in which we're looking at. Maybe there's a stable government, the same actors in place. I think it's a little bit tenuous, because I think if you have a natural disaster, an earthquake or something of that size, it has a political shock as well. But to some extent, there's a logical progression there in terms of from the humanitarian to the development domains. What I find deeply problematic is the assumptions that you can do a similar thing in what some people would define as a true humanitarian context, one where there is violence, a political disruption, a man-made effect on a significant portion of the population. Why? Because I find it very hard to accept that you can have a continuation, either in time or in geography or in political space, which goes from the critical, violent moment to something which is more stable. I think that inherently we don't want that same political progression. We need something to change to solve it. And therefore I find that the underpinning political umbrella that we're claiming to be able to hook our presence and our action on is not just not a continuum, but there's a schism in there. There's a schism that goes from the political domain of a humanitarian crisis to a political domain which will allow for a longer term progression or implementation of programs. This gets more complicated when you add in the third component of the nexus and the peace building or the peace development element of it. And that's even more difficult, because this is an assumption that we can make. We can say that we're actually going to actively be changing the political dimension that we're working under. It's not just responding to the needs, either humanitarian or development may they be, but it's actually saying we're going to use our resources, our means of programming, to change the political context in which we're working under. We're going to use our programs, we're going to use our resources to actually change the construct of the political dimension of the people that we are working with. What do I mean by that? A very crude example. Humanitarianism, a humanitarian response, as many people will know, is fundamentally based on an impartial provision of assistance. If you are providing a water and sanitation service to somewhere, therefore you should provide it where that's most needed. If we're looking at a peace development or a peace building agenda, there's a compromise in there. There's an inherent negotiation as to where the facilities, maybe it's a latrine, should be located to be able to get the buy-in of those populations around you to enable a different agenda, to enable a peace building agenda, to be able to an agenda which is not just based on services, but is based on the political constructs. And so we're changing not just the programming, but the political frame in which we're working. And for me, that's deeply problematic. And this is a problem which is caused by the actors within the development and humanitarian sphere, rather than just responding to the context around us. One of the other, moving on a little bit to discuss, I'd like to discuss a little bit more about criminalization, and for MSF at the moment, the notion of criminalization of aid, criminalization of care providers is a major discussion, and we're pushing ourselves to understand a little bit more what we mean by it. And I think what's useful here is to go back to the basics in terms of what criminalization actually is, and outside of the humanitarian context. In the most basic fundamental state, the most basic sort of fundamental interpretation of criminalization, I mean, I think it's essentially it's a public policy tool which then allows the state to use its means to enact on its population. It's essentially, in the most benign state, something to address possible harmful consequences of an individual action or a group of actions, and then allows for punishment and transgression. It allows the state, gives the state license to use its coercive powers to correct something. But we see that this notion in itself is not uncontroversial. There is a drift somewhere where things, for example, there's a line somewhere between obscenity and a crime. When is something just distasteful, and when does it become a crime? To what extent do we want our ability to criminalize people? How broad do we want it to be? How narrow is it? Should it be a specialized activity, or should it be a broad net? Are punitive measures, when it comes to responding to a criminal act, are they too hard? Are they too soft? Do they discriminate against certain members of society? So from the most general sense, I think we're used to, as societies, to understand that that criminalization in itself is problematic. But what does it mean in a humanitarian context? If we look at it, or if we look at it towards a humanitarian organization, it's not just about the law, it's not just about punishment, it's also what do people think about you. And the term criminal and criminalization is obviously something which is very laden with value. It means certain things, it has certain connotations. And as we and other humanitarian organizations are labeled with the label criminal, whether that's because of criminal activities that have been carried out within the Mediterranean, or whether one of our actions is considered to be a terrorist. And we'll come on to talk to a little bit about a specific manifestation of criminalization. This has impacts in terms of how people see us, both the people that we're trying to assist and the people who support us back home. So a criminalization narrative is problematic both from our access to our patients, but also to our donors and supporters in Europe, in North America, all around the world, when it comes to us being associated to migration, search and rescue activities for migrants in the Mediterranean, what does that do very simply, not only to our access to those patients, but in terms of our donor funding, to our supporters, to our political support that we get back in our home countries. And how does this criminalization, how does it manifest? Well, there are many different routes through which it could happen, but one thing that we're finding particularly complicated at the moment is the pervasive nature of counterterrorism legislation. And for those unfamiliar, it sort of originates, this sort of body of law originates somewhere post 9/11. There are different parts of the sort of the global legal framework in which there were different starting moments from a humanitarian perspective, linked to the war in Afghanistan, and the linkages there between humanitarian responders and militaries. Became, for example, schemes developed by the US government, such as partner vetting mechanisms, which basically insisted that humanitarian organizations would run their staff through lists of potential terrorists, cross-checking them against huge long databases of people who were suspected of terrorist activity, but also contractors to determine where your money was flowing, to see if there could be any links between the humanitarian organizations and terrorist organizations. But this, in my mind, this body of law, which is now finding its way very much embedded into domestic legislations. It's adopted through domestic legislative frameworks. It's adopted into British law, to American law, and then a lot of these laws are then copy and pasted into the countries that we work, which essentially then allows for local determination of what is a terrorist. It allows, essentially, it gives the state the control of determining what a terrorist is. Nothing particularly new there. But what I think we're seeing is the concepts of terrorist and enemy becoming blurred, becoming as one, and we're seeing that being able to, I'm sorry, let me take a step back. When these concepts of terrorism and enemy are blurred, we're necessarily forcing and overlapping a couple of important bodies of law: the counter-terrorism law when it comes to the terrorist definition, but also international humanitarian law when it comes to the concern around enemies. And we're seeing this conflict of the two legal frameworks. This is obviously tricky from our perspective, and we need to start to address these issues both from a practical but also from a political perspective. Practically, one thing we're looking at in particular is how do we gain humanitarian exemptions for counterterrorism legislation? How do we ensure that when there is a situation where international humanitarian law applies, how do we ensure that we can get exemptions from a counter-terrorism perspective? But also we need to start looking at this issue from a political perspective as well. And this is where it gets, I think, very complicated, because it's very difficult to sell a narrative which is counter-terrorism. Counter-terrorism does not necessarily mean pro-terrorism, but it's a tricky thing to be able to sell in the public domain. How do we start to address publicly issues where we have issues with the counter-terrorism legislation, but how do we contradict that narrative? And I think that what we need to really start be doing is really articulating the direct impact that this has on many of the populations in which we work. But how do we do that? Well, this is essentially, I don't have any other answers except for really coming back to the basics. We've got to continue to push for access to the most vulnerable people that we can in the most remote places. And again, going back to my initial point, to focusing on the people behind the data, behind the global narratives, to be able to ensure that we are addressing the needs of people as opposed to the systems or a global structure that we are working within. And we need to come back to principles, but we need to come back to principles in a sense of what do these principles mean now? What does it mean to be neutral in a complex legal setting? What does it mean to be neutral in a situation where we have such intense information flows, such a vast amount of data to be able to work through and to be able to manipulate? What does neutrality mean in a contemporary age? And I think that this is a struggle that we're going to face for the next few years. Along and sort of coming a little bit out of the political and legal frame. Obviously, our programming is becoming more and more complicated. We're seeing an increasing volume of patients. This is a good thing. We're seeing more people, and therefore we can address more needs. But also, the programs that we're trying to address as the diseases and the programs that we're trying to implement are getting more and more complicated. We need more diverse teams in terms of expertise. And we need more technical capacity, as well as being able to get these people and these expertise to where the needs really are. Just in terms of a couple of the challenging contexts that we have at the moment, we're trying to maintain the presence in the Mediterranean. So far this year, over 8,000 people have tried to cross the Mediterranean Sea. Being able to maintain the operation in the Mediterranean is highly complex in terms of not only the logistical and the safety aspects of such an operation, but as I think many people have heard, being able to just get the ships to where they should be at the right time and allowing people to disembark. Also, we see an Ebola response in DRC, which is highly challenging from an access point of view, largely working under the constraints of the government of Congo, but also trying to learn the mistakes that we made in the West African outbreak, particularly how do we move away from working through huge amounts of protective equipment that depersonalizes the response, and how do we ensure that we can put the people at the center of our response in highly technical areas such as Ebola. And also a big challenge that we're facing at the moment is how do we look at humanitarian response through a climate lens. And I tend to think that that the people that we work for, are generally speaking the worst affected by the climate emergency. But we should not necessarily frame our responses just through that lens. It's an exacerbating factor. It's a strategic question in terms of how we should adjust our programming. But I'm not sure we should have climate response at the center of our humanitarian action. I think it's a cause rather than necessarily something to respond to. Finally, and I will stop. My mouth has gone very dry. A little note on academia and research. I think that there are a number of important intersections between the humanitarian sector and the academic world. I think from a research perspective, a lot of can you see yourselves in the picture? Yeah. I can't. There are for links between the humanitarian sector and the academic world. There's a couple of domains in which we can look at this. Firstly, some of these questions are incredibly difficult questions to ask, let alone to answer. I think that especially when you are working with, for, and in an organization which is a busy organization that is a responding organization, just being able to frame the questions that we need to ask in terms of how do we make ourselves more person-centered? How do we address issues such as climate change in our humanitarian response? Just framing those questions is difficult within the context of a humanitarian organization. So there is obviously a natural link in terms of both the expertise which is out there, and the operational linking the operational response to the expertise is out there. I think that the two are largely symbiotic, but also there's also, and I think that the LEAP project, which obviously many of you are highly engaged in, is an important example of not just how we develop our people, our key resource in all of this, but how do we better our response? I think if we're making our teams more critical, more questioning, and less accepting of these dogmas and this data that is out there, then that can only be good for how we can respond better. So I'm going to stop there to see if there's any questions. There's one over.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So we're living in an increasingly in a world where it's increasingly difficult for journalists and media to access essentially conflicts situations, whether that's because of safety concerns of journalists themselves, or whether that's the lack of money in newspapers and the media, which means that foreign correspondents essentially get cut. And that means the consequences of that is you have an information gap in terms of what actually is going on in a conflict situation. And that means that NGOs like MSF are in a particularly privileged position, I guess, in order to sort of plug that gap. Just referring back to the bearing witness policy of MSF, like what actual active steps does MSF actually take to put into action the bearing witness policy, and from is there a particular set of set of processes that MSF worker on the ground in a conflict situation follow in order to sort of report on human rights that have been evaded with regards to patients that they've seen, and then from the information from the ground, how does that get taken up amongst the supranational actors?
So I don't think there's one answer to that question, usually with a great deal of difficulty, I would say. So in general speaking, I mean, what would underpin the policy in terms of bearing witness is bearing witness. So seeing it ourselves, and what seeing it can mean a few different things as well. So it can be in terms of actually seeing patients in front of us and the experience and hearing their experiences. It can be through identifying increasing numbers of patients, increasing disease burden in some areas, and so from a more data-related perspective. Then in terms of how that is delivered, depends on what is likely to be the most impactful way of delivering that. So it can be a stereotypical press statement, press conference. news interviews on one hand. It could be publishing through academic journals on another hand. It could be, I mean, one of the most important tensions that we have in this is, so if we make a statement when it comes to bearing witness in a particular location, what does that mean for our programs? What does it mean for our people on the ground? Does it affect their safety, and does it affect our ability to maintain that presence? And this is a continual tension that we have. And being a relatively complex organisation, there's usually a lot of different opinions as to how far to push that risk. And so the process for getting to that is usually a discursive process of arguing out the pros and cons of doing it and how to do it. And usually, I would say that pretty much every case is unique.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up a bit on your point of what you're calling criminalization of aid. So in my country, in the Netherlands, the government has recently passed some legislation that makes it mandatory for journalists and aid workers to report to the government if they're going to certain areas which the Dutch government considers to be risk areas, and it's kind of vague and it can change all the time. Of course, that can be quite problematic for us. So I'm just wondering, from the perspective of MSF, what is the response of the organization, and is the response more geared towards negotiating, as you were saying, exception, or is it more demanding that humanitarians and journalists should be able to go to these places without any government? So is it more demanding our right or negotiating?
I mean, I think the framing of demanding our right, I have a little bit of an issue with that framing of it. But taking this particular, and so I speak for myself, bearing in mind that there's a long way to go in terms of the policy development around this. In terms of this general pervasive criminalization that we see, I mean, there are other examples in terms of, the Dutch one is a very acute and recent example. But there are other examples such as knowing information related to terrorism in the UK can be a criminal offence if you don't report it along the right channels. But my personal opinion on this case, this is so obvious in terms of who it's targeting, how it works, and what it will do to the humanitarian project in general. My personal feeling is that we need a standout example to counter strongly and publicly. So it's more towards the demand your rights side of the spectrum, without framing it in that regard. But I would say with this one, it's a very clear and striking example, and we can't let it go to miss.
Well, sorry. Okay. So my question is regarding the things that we have as tools to fight against counter-humanitarianism, which is a quite particular term to use. But I mean, for us in the field, it's very difficult to really engage in a horizontal conversation with the states, both even in IHL frameworks or counterterrorism frameworks, because there's no really binding instruments that we can use at a field level. I know that there has been a lot of communication efforts. I know that there has been a lot of international level efforts to reinforce what was already in IHL framework. But at a field level, it is still very complicated to really quite manage all the different situations, because we actually have been discussing this in the LEAP program, and one of the main things that we said is that it's not always a straightforward attack of states against humanitarians. It's also kind of underground things that they do to avoid you to go to certain places, to avoid certain people to go into the field. So what do you think that we should do you think that we should try to engage in a supranational conversation at each field? I mean, because there are differences, like big differences at every different projects. So we should try to escalate the situation always, or would you keep it at field level?
I think I think that's one of the key challenges that we have when we have these global trends, but they're different everywhere. It's the same across the world, but it's different everywhere. And this is a really complicated question to answer. I think when we address things at a global level, we have to be really careful because we risk the oversimplification. And if we oversimplify and we don't get the change that we need, then that doesn't help anybody. That doesn't help anybody in the field. I think that there is a lot of laborious work with these issues. I think that if you take the counterterrorism legislation example, I think that the way around it is working locally as in per country, with the governments there, and looking at the specific clauses in their domestic legislation which they adopt, which manifest these concerns, and working for exemptions on a case-by-case basis. I tend to go with that approach because I think that is the approach where you can also have better communication to the people who are responsible for enforcing those laws as well, so the local police and military or whatever. But it's a very difficult question. It's easy to feel comfortable in addressing it at a global level because it's the simplest thing to do.
Thanks. Sorry, maybe just to pick up on that question, or to take a different angle, I was just reading that in Nigeria, USAID have now put clauses into their grant agreements for NGOs to state that they can't fund or provide assistance to anyone who is formally affiliated with Boko Haram or the Islamic State.
Yeah.
What formally affiliated means is obviously unclear. I think we see that same trend in our whole in Syria, where people who are considered to be affiliated with the Islamic State, there's questions about how deserving they are of humanitarian assistance. Separate to that, in Venezuela, I think you see the US highly politicizing the delivery of aid, not funding public programs because they're affiliated with the Maduro government. So my question, I guess, is, isn't there also, in terms of having a localized approach to be able to respond to this, isn't there also the need to have a localized approach at the donor level and respond to those specific governments that are driving this agenda?
Yes, I no, completely. And localized, I don't mean to assume just in the field. I mean in London as well as in Washington. I mean what you're describing in terms of the USAID clauses is nothing new in terms of State Department and USAID policies when it comes to the genesis of this legislation. It goes back like 10 years or so when this started to happen. So and that is a local effort, which then has potentially global consequences. But it also works the other way around as well. If you can get a certain critical mass at an operational level as well, where there is a rejection of these clauses at that level, then you have an interest at the donor level to not be forcing this, because donors still need to implement. I mean, they still have a necessity to be able to spend their money to report back in terms of what they're doing. So I think, local can be from either side of the equation, for sure.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I had two questions, and in a similar way. You've talked about one about the new way of working / nexus, and the other one about criminalization of aid. And so, well, maybe they're different. Let's start with new way of working and Nexus One. I know it's a debate, and I feel it's more of an institutional debate or a donor-led debate. So my question would be, do we actually see consequences, like concrete examples in the field of these policies having an impact and preventing people from accessing aid, for example, humanitarian aid? Or is it just some kind of, theoretical us and them, we are humanitarian actors, they're development actors, peace actors, we don't want to be mixed, we're not doing the same thing. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Which has always existed and used to be called different things. Linking relief to rehabilitation and development happened in the 90s, so now it's called Nexus. For me, there's nothing new under the sun, so I really wonder what's new concretely in terms of impeding our work in the field. I don't know. I was wondering whether you had examples or
I have
other people had.
You had two questions.
Yeah, but I mean, we.
Let's see. So I have, fortunately, experience of being outside of MSF relatively recently as well. So I'll use an example from there when I was working for ACF. And in terms of being able to implement purely humanitarian programs in Nigeria, Maiduguri in particular, the restrictions that the requirements that we were put on to be able to also link it to a broader development agenda, which we didn't, to be honest, have the expertise to be able to do, meant that we didn't get all of the funding that we could have got to be able to implement the humanitarian programs that we intended to. So in that sense, it would have been a false application. We could have probably have said that we could do X, Y, or Z and tried to convince along that way, but we didn't, and therefore we lost some funding as a result of that. So I would say, in that regard, yes. Now, from an MSF perspective, then I would say, what does that mean in terms of the global humanitarian response capacity that you have in a particular context? I mean, it's not all. There's a lot more money in the development funding stream than there is in the humanitarian funding stream. So you can also argue it from the other way around, saying that if you bring these two together, you get to benefit from that funding stream as well, which is why a lot of the humanitarian actors have agreed to this. They see access to a much bigger, broader funding stream as well. It's not necessarily all bad, but they'll go back to the point that the political underpinnings to be able to do this well, in terms of having a continuum where this actually allows you to implement both sides of this coin, or this progression of programming, I don't think really exists when you have a humanitarian context. Is that?
Yeah, thanks. My second question is related to criminalization of aid is similar. Is for me, so the debate at the moment revolves a lot around the risks and the threats that it represents for us, NGOs. But again, do we have? So we're talking about laws, like states adopt some laws, and you've mentioned that. But in terms of the actual ability to enforce them and to, again, impede our work concretely, there are a few examples. I think Oxfam withdrew from Palestine recently, which is quite a big example and for related reasons. Yes. But again, I'm curious to hear from you and others if you have examples of the actual consequences, more than we're discussing about how you anticipate this risk and how you would respond and how you would negotiate exemptions, etc. But for now, have we really been impacted? Because, as you said, it's been at least 15 years. It's post 9/11, so it's been a long time that it's existed. These anti-terrorism laws.
I think simply the designation as a terrorist, which can and has happened, in itself is highly problematic for us, because that then, I mean, I think the answer is yes. I mean, there is direct impact if you are labelled as a terrorist, then that has consequences. That has consequences on a number of levels, legal levels, and so legal processes can be started against you. Also, political consequences in terms of how you are viewed in a variety of societies. So, I say yes, and I'm explicitly not saying which countries that examples happen in, but examples happen.
I mean, I think one of the issues that it raises with us is just a very basic issue of security, and in particular, the security of colleagues who are from the countries concerned. So, I mean, I'm the General Director of MSF in the UK. Counterterrorism legislation has hardened significantly here recently, and we've been going through a risk assessment process in relation to the return of UK citizens into the country once they've been working in places like northeast Syria, for example, which is on the verge of being designated by the UK government as somewhere that UK citizens can't go. But at the end of the day, the UK, despite that hardening of the context, is a country where the rule of law still applies. And yet we work in many places where that's really not the case. So I think the biggest concern I have is far from UK citizens. It's our colleagues who are working in countries such as Nigeria, such as Palestine, etc., that are really right on the sharp end of this. And when MSF is negotiating access, I mean, as everybody knows, we tend to work in the more challenging contexts with mixed teams, but ultimately it's the people from the country, the front line of those negotiations. And for me, that's our biggest concern. We're potentially putting people from countries at risk in relation to allegations of terrorist activity, but we rely on them for negotiated access. So what does that mean for our access? And I think, I mean, Chris wasn't very specific about the countries, but there are countries where we're seeing this happen today.
We have an active list of cases, which is very real and direct and growing. We also are trying to work with a few other organisations, ICRC and NRC in particular, to be able to share experiences on it. But it's a real threat to individuals as well as to the organisation. But a lot of these are active legal cases at the moment.